Hey, brief video. Look at my hair, looking good here. Um, yeah, Fissures of Imagination. So, uh, yeah, you know, I'm doing a lot of personal work, or not even personal work. I'm not doing work. I'm just observing. I'm doing a lot of observation between different elemental states of consciousness, as always, right? Earth, water, air, earth, water, fire, air, spirit, etc. Earth, water, earth, water is a really important state of consciousness to understand. Now, when I'm talking about these elemental movements, I mean, there's a bunch of ways you can think about this. When people are working with the chakras, they don't tend to discuss it this way, but people who work with the magical Kabbalah talk a lot about this path working idea. And what path working is you're basically moving between different states of consciousness. So, like um, typically how it works is there are different Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, and each path between the Sephiroth has uh, has a definition. Now, in some of those definitions, those are defined using the tarot in magical Kabbalah. That's not the way it's done in real Kabbalah, or real Kabbalah in Jewish Kabbalah. Um, but uh, but the whole idea is to allow your mind to perambulate, not a word I get to use very often, to perambulate those states of consciousness, to contemplate, if you will, those states of consciousness. And it's really important to do this, but it's important on a number of levels. And the reason I bring it up is because, like, you can look at this on a personal level, and you can also look at it on a social level. And I guess that's where I'm going with this is like the social level. So it seems to me like it seems to me that the problem with our society at the moment is that there's massive astral fissures. There's astral fissures. It's the fissure of the imagination. And it's really confusing because there's no dialogue in society today about consciousness. And that's why it's so confusing. So I'm going to, what am I going to say here? I'm going to say that in our society, there's a whole bunch. I think that the word of the moment is wokeness. This wokeness of society, um, which is which seems to be about creating about well what they call it these days is they call it equity, right? So there's various types of equity. I'm not even sure what all the terminology is because the terminology changes all the time. But there's a whole bunch of examples about this about trying to create equality or equity. And equity seems to mean equality of outcome rather than just equality or whatever that means. Um, and this language uh, seems to be it seems to be part of what you would call the discourse of deconstruction. It's Marxist. It's Marxist discourse, and but that's less important. It's less important as Marxist. But what is important is the it seems to be imaginary in the best sense of the word. Now, what's interesting is I was watching some YouTube thing, the news, I guess, and they were talking about what's his name, Chappelle, Dave Chappelle, his name, who I don't actually like as a comedian. I don't find him funny at all. But he did do this thing recently about transgender stuff and how how gender is real. Gender is a real thing, for which I concur 100%. But there's this aspect of certain groups wanting to create very large acronyms like LGBT, RGB, TV, whatever it is, right? And Is that valid, right? Is it is it valid? And so what my I guess I'm not going to perambulate too much on this. I guess my point on this, my take on this is that it is valid, but it's imaginary. So it's not based on the physical world. It's based on imaginary categories, right? Or they're based on thought structures. They're based on thought structures. And the reason this is important, I guess, is because it really comes it's kind of like a non-duality thing. It's like is that one of the things that happens when you live in presence is you become aware of what is real, like what is actually real, what is real and what is thought, what is a thought structure and where do thought structures come from. And so it seems to me that the like most this entire discourse, which is being foisted on the public as truth in all of its manifestations, uh, is basically imaginary. It's coming from a different level of consciousness, which doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean it's not valid. It just means that it's there's some kind of fissure between the astral, between the water plane and the earth plane. And those fissures are often caused by trauma on the personal level. I'm not sure if that's what happens on the social level. I guess it does. I guess it's caused by trauma. And so I'm not negating the validity of the what's the word? Effluent, not effluence. Not the validity of the ejection of information from this fissure from the astral world, which you see the thing is when you move into imagination, everything is possible. There's literally no limitations and everything's possible. And you can have like multiple categories of, you can have 50 genders and it's great. The problem is it's just not real on this level of consciousness, right? And you can say, well, it's what we make it or what we think, but what you're saying is it's what we think, it's what we make it. It's not what it is, right? It's not what it is. There are clearly two genders and trauma. I think that's what you should call it. Rather than calling it LGBTV, you should just call it trauma. You should call it male, female, and the traumatic, right? The traumatized. And the trauma refracts thousands of refracted rays of perturbed, traumatized psychology. Um, which is kind of sad. So it's funny because, like, on a personal level, if you're meditating, you often run into these kind of structures in your own form, right? You're going to run into your own your own fissures into the astral, and part of the process of elemental balance is trying to figure out how can you balance these. And so, like on the personal level, one of the things to do is just observe, quietly observe what the dynamics are between these states of consciousness, and uh, and try to come to terms with what significance they have, with what reality they have, from where they emerge, and sort of try and understand what they are. But as I was saying, there's we don't even have a cultural discussion about consciousness. None. Nobody talks about this. I mean, there's no discussion of consciousness of any kind, really, on a mainstream platform. Probably on philosophical chats, people are talking about this stuff, maybe, but the balancing, especially of the imaginary and the physical world, is really dangerous. If it's not balanced, it's clearly really dangerous. Um, so I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were telling me that apparently they had seen an interview with Vladimir Putin, and Putin was saying, and I'm a big fan of Vladimir Putin. And Russia generally. Um, But I think what they were saying was that Putin was saying that the current multicultural discourse, which the West has embraced, is actually very reminiscent of the discourse which was occurring in Bolshevism in Russia, and it basically destroyed Russia, is what he said. And you see, what happens is language, and it's not just language, because language is one manifestation of the it's one manifestation of it, but it's like you see the astral is addictive because of its infinite qualities, because the imagination is infinite. But when the imagination gains a foothold into physical reality, the people who can perceive it easily become addicted to what its various states of consciousness can present, because it presents unlimited bounty, completely unlimited. Now, in a world of roadblocks, difficulties, and problems, discovering complete liberation in the imaginary world feels like something really wonderful. But the problem is that the problem is the imagination consciousness from that level of consciousness works on many levels, and nobody's aware of the levels it works at. It works first of all in or I don't know if this is first of all, but one of the ways it works is it works visually in the consciousness, presenting images of various types. It works verbally. It works through emotion. And so what you've got is you've a whole bunch of conscious threads coming from another layer of consciousness into the physical world to people who have no understanding of consciousness. And so what happens is they latch on to some of these ideas, which, wow, it's so wonderful. And you see, what the imagination wants is it wants to become real. It wants to change its state of consciousness. And so it co-opts the consciousnesses of physical reality to try and make its presence known. There's lots of these sort of types of it's not just social stuff. I mean, it's like there's substances. You could say the same thing about substances, right? You say something about drugs and alcohol, tobacco. These are consciousnesses which are co-opting humanity to, and maybe co-opting is the wrong idea. I think it's kind of like consciousness in many ways. Well, water element consciousness and other consciousness too are sort of fluid. So when there's a hole, it's like a dam. When there's a hole, the water just by nature moves into that. So it's not like these consciousnesses are trying to take advantage of human consciousness. What happens is generally maybe things are more established, but when trauma occurs in consciousness, it creates fissures which allow the entrance of other styles of consciousness. So for a good example of this is there was a guy on the Facebook group who contacted me at one point, and he had been some kind of gangster or something. I don't remember what it was. He'd been some kind of gangster in the UK, and he was doing lots of cocaine, and they had to stop because he became psychic. He did so much cocaine he became psychic, and he called me up one day, And he was saying, this is the funny part of the story. He's like, "Do you know a Robert?" I'm like, "No." He's like, "Well, he's standing right beside you." Psychic, right? So, but my point is that the trauma which caused this guy to become a gangster, which caused him to do lots of cocaine, created the fissure which allowed the inflow of a different level of consciousness into physical reality, right? And yeah. So, does physical reality exist? I mean, that's the question that people should be asking themselves. Is especially my liberal friends who are bought into this philosophy of what is known in some circles as wokeism, although I don't really know what it's called. But the idea, hold on a second, as wokeism, boom, there we are. Um, Especially people who are sort of bought into this idea of that this is good, and it seems to be a lot of people. I used to teach in university, and like a lot of my friends are extremely liberal and believe all this stuff. Um, and like violently so. Like a lot of people are really violent about their beliefs about these subject matters because it seems like it's so true. It must be true. But what happens is that those conscious structures from the water element are they're inherently frictionless. There's much less friction in 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 conscious structures from that element, right? And so what happens? It's almost like when you allow your consciousness to move around structures from the water element, it just feels really good because they're so it's almost like they're so smooth, they're so smooth and shiny or something, and it's like wow, it's like it just feels good to allow your consciousness to move around these structures. And we don't even have a dialogue in our society about what consciousness feels like, you know. But these different conscious structures feel good, and so when you get a fissure from the imaginary world into physical reality, um, it feels good to allow your mind to perambulate around them. I'm using this word perambulate a lot. I just want to make sure there we go. Yeah, that's why I thought it was okay. Just making sure I get the right vocabulary here. So when you move your consciousness around structures which we're not familiar with, they can be very delightful to think about in all of their manifestations. Um, in fact, I'm pretty sure this is why people become alcoholics because, like, what happens is alcohol also opens some kind. Well, I mean, it opens the possibility to perceive, or yeah, to perceive a different feeling of consciousness. It softens consciousness. That's what people like about alcohol. It softens consciousness, and so it feels soft and as we know, it's very addictive, right? And people try and quit and they can't because once the fissure is created, once the fissure into the physical world is created, then the consciousness, it is consciousness and it wants to continue its manifestation in the physical world. So it's kind of like what's the word? It's kind of like being possessed or something in a way. But it's just being possessed. It's not even by an entity as such. It's just by a style of consciousness, which feels good, right? Because it's so unordinary. It's not an ordinary feeling to be aware of a different style of consciousness. Actually, these days it is ordinary because so many people are doing it on so many different levels. There are so many different ways to perceive alternate levels of consciousness, but we don't recognize it because we just think we're thinking about something, right? But thinking is just like the cover. thinking is just like the outer layer of the flow of consciousness. And so what you might recognize is you might recognize a thought coming into your mind, but you don't recognize the flow of the energy because it sort of rides on sort of a pranic, or in this case, sort of an elemental energy. And I'm saying water element. I may not be right with that in all of these instances, but it's a good place to sort of work from, since it is fluid and it is the closest to the physical world. But some of these forces may enter through the water element from higher levels. Uh, but it's really so you can see this on the social level, right? I mean, it's like, and it's difficult maybe to recognize it on a social level. It's difficult to recognize it on a social level. My mom's calling me. Hold on a second. Let me just turn her off, maybe. Hold on a second. Oops. Hold on a second. Let me just send them a message. Hold on a second. Um, yeah. So these uh, these feelings of consciousness, like on a personal level, and this is the interesting part, of course, is because like on a personal level, everybody's got their own fissures, right, into the astral or wherever it might be. It's typically the astral world and into imaginary structures. And in fact, since most people are not living in the presence, most people are not living in presence. So if you're not living in presence, you're actually living in a capsule. You're living in a capsule of imagination, essentially, right? And that's really hard to believe. I was watching an ad. There was an ad on Facebook there by Eckhart Tolle, and he was saying, he's like, if you're listening to this right now and you feel like this, maybe it seems interesting, that probably means that you might be ready for this teaching about presence. And the thing with presence is that it's just so subtle. The difference between living in presence and not living in presence, it's imperceptible. It's almost imperceptible because it's so subtle. Where I've noticed it is like I go for my long walks along the canal, and and in meditation too. But like as I walk along the canal, I'll be looking around, and what I'll do is I'll go through this process of like looking at the leaves, which are very green. I'll look at the flowers, which are yellow, and the water, which is reflective, and the sky, and you're actually living in that moment, and it's great. But then if you sit and watch your mind, excuse me, the mind, the mind filters in. It's almost like it's almost like slowly dialing up the exposure on a camera because it's the same, you're in the same place, but suddenly it's very gradually and minutely the interpretation of information around you changes. And so what might happen is all of a sudden one of the shapes will fire off a memory or an idea, and now you're back into the mind state. But it's extremely subtle. And the problem is because we identify our whole lives with the mind, it's totally comfortable getting pulled into that. You're like, okay, boom. And you're like, all of a sudden you realize you're in some dialogue with a whole colorful sequence of events, and you're not actually in the real world. You're not here. One of the things I do in meditation is, and of those of you guys who've watched me over these years with my whole thing in meditation, I was going through a whole thing with working with the imagination, which is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful working with the imagination and getting to know its unbelievable power. But what's really interesting is working with physical reality. and just sitting and watching the action of the senses. Look at the sense of smell, look at the sense of taste, listen to the sounds, look at the light information and dark information. And there's a good phrase I learned this week from a book on somatic body therapy, which is called pendulation, which is a great word for something I've been doing for years, which is what you do is you think about something and then you think about something else and you move between them. You move between two different ideas, and they call that pendulation, like a pendulum, moving between the two ideas. And so this is a really great practice. It's something Franz Berdon talks about a bit in his books, is you think about something, you think about a physical smell. Like recently I just lit this Palo Santo. Don't want to snort it. Really strong smell. Then you take it away and you imagine a different smell, and you uh, pendulate, or I think the word I'm using is perambulate today, right? You pendulate or perambulate between those two ideas, between the physical sense of smell and the imaginary sense of smell, right? And this practice trains your mind to be aware of the differences between physicality and imagination, and it trains you to start sensing the incredibly subtle distinctions between those two things. And the funny thing is the imaginary. I mean, listen, the imaginary world is infinitely powerful. It's fucked up. It's infinitely powerful, and it almost wants to achieve manifestation in physical reality, but it's not of this world. It's not physical reality, right? But it's tendrils of awareness enter into this world through your consciousness. And so on a personal level, you have to at least be aware of this. I mean, you can choose to allow imagination to have free play, right? Complete free play. The problem is most people aren't conscious of that. Most people are allowing it to happen. They're allowing the entrance of imagination through their consciousness without being aware of that's what's happening, right? And I think that explains the addictive quality of society, American society, is that there's a whole bunch of tendrils being permitted into our world by people who are completely unconscious and uneducated that any of the, and not just they're not just uneducated, but they're hypnotized to the idea that consciousness isn't real, that God doesn't exist, and that they should be happy with basically a programmed sequence, a programmed state machine of sequenced events which represent your life, which for many people represent getting a job, working, and having a family, which is okay. And many, the thing is, most all this stuff is okay if it's done consciously, right? It's just that you have to be aware of what is moving, what energies are moving through you. So the practice of awareness, watching, especially for astral. And for me, I mean, it's important for me because I'm addicted to various substances, and not hugely, not hugely addicted. You know, like I'm not like drinking drinking a case of beer every night or anything like that. You know, but once every couple of weeks, I'm like, oh man. I gotta have a drink. It's crazy. And it's like I can see it. I'm like, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to have a drink. I want to go and like go running. But it's this force. It's this force. It's like it wants manifestation, right? And that's a light force. That's not even that powerful. It's actually quite easy to quit drinking. What's hard to quit drinking is coffee, he said, grabbing his coffee. And there's lots of these substances, right? There's the tobacco, incredibly addictive. Um, there's thousands of these substances, right? Promoted, participated in. Uh, and I think one of the ways this is interesting to me in particular is because like when I started getting into meditation, it seemed very tantric to me, right? And for me, it was like based more on, it seemed like more based on the magical tantra, which is specifically sexual, right? So with magical tantra, a la, uh, like the OTO stuff, Aleister Crowley stuff, you literally use sexual visualizations to enter into the pranic field. And I don't think that's a bad idea. I think it's really useful because it trains you that that exists. It's really useful. But then when I discovered that there was a field of joy, when you discover there's a field of joy, and when you discover that the sexual field can be transformed into pure love, um, it becomes really fascinating that these energy fields can be cultivated into something which is not programmed. So that's interesting. Like, so on a personal level, you can kind of like cultivate these ideas. You can enter into them, and then you can sort of become aware of them and cultivate and recognize them through observation and through sort of penetration into their deeper core ideas. Because one of the things that happens, especially with like the sexual tantra stuff, is that you start, and like if you look at some of the Crowley stuff, I mean, there's some of the stuff. It's very couched in metaphorical ideas. But the one I can't remember which document it is, but one of these documents there, which has a ritual in it, involves visualizing the spine as a vagina and the energy moving up as a penis. And so you literally imagine this sort of this metaphor of the sexual act going up and down your spine until the orgasm, which happens in like your pineal gland kind of thing, right? So it's what it does is it uses the imagination to sort of remap. It uses the imagination to remap what physical reality is. And you might say that's crazy. And it would be easy to say that that kind of ceremony is based on trauma, right? Which it probably is. And but what's interesting about him too is like he was very clear about the idea is that as you work the sexual energy, that you didn't sort of you would hold the sexual energy and use it for other purposes. So it became an observational act, and by making it observational, it changed the quality of the energy into something else, right? It changed it into a different quality of energy. Like when you pool energy and you hold it and recognize it and observe what it is, it's no longer, it transforms into something else. So I don't know if that can be done on a social level. Can wokeism be cultivated into some higher form of consciousness? which is more useful and which is not. You see, it seems like the whole wokeism thing is actually it's a tendril of consciousness moving through this fissure into the physical world through the minds of well-meaning people who don't realize they've been they're that they're riding on this wave of energy which doesn't correspond with physical reality because very clearly there are two genders. The end. Everything else are thought structures, right? And the idea of listen, I went to a liberal school. I was an English major, and everything we studied was Marxist. It was literally Marxist theory. It's openly discussed as Marxist criticism of literature. Completely. It's complete open Marxist criticism. And at the time, I didn't even know what that meant. I'm like, okay. And so, you learn it, and it's a valuable discussion. Even in my book, which I wrote, I got a whole chapter about Michel Foucault, who's one of the the chief progenitors of deconstructive philosophy. And the whole idea of deconstruction, what that means is it's deconstruction attempts to move through language, move through culture, move through ideas, and unravel the power forms which are there. The problem is that usually it identifies power with the patriarchy or with white males and all this nonsense, right? Power is is just implicit in all places. It's just implicit, and it's not even power. It's prana. It's fucking prana is what holds it together, right? So deconstruction. Yeah, I'm just like I should just preface this. I'm just like freestyling here, right? I'm just making this up as I go. I haven't thought about this much. I'm just sort of like I'm sort of thinking out loud here. But it seems to me that deconstruction is an anti-pranic force, which or it's a destructive. It's a destructive. It's a destructive force, and destruction feels good. But I mean, essentially, it's essentially it's from the dark side, right? It's from the dark side. Um, if it's true as all the deconstructionists say that like everything is made of power relationships, then really that idea needs to be reflected onto deconstruction itself and like what power what power structures is it based on and supporting, right? What power structures does deconstruction find itself perched upon? I mean, it's easy to move into things like, say, satanic or it's Luciferian or whatever it is, but like, but even though, even those appellations are like huge generalizations, but people need to be aware of like what that is because it's being pushed at every level. So yeah, I guess the world is changing really rapidly and changing very rapidly the world, right? And what is the where do you place your flag, right? So yeah, I'm against wokeism. I'm against liberalism in all of its forms as it's presented today. Uh, I'm against. critical race theory. I'm against Joe Biden and anybody related to him. Um, yeah, but who knows what the future holds? I mean, the whole thing is so deformed and crippled and destroyed that I noticed that Jason Georgiani, who I interviewed here, I think on his Facebook the other day, he was saying that, America's done. I mean, there's just nothing. There's no return. It's over. So it seems to me that what's going on in the world is that most of the influx, I don't know if you've seen this video, there's an old video, like, I can't remember who the guy's name is. Who's that guy called? But there's a great video by some Russian agent who talks about the demoralization and how the Russians have been working on the demoralization of America. And there's various techniques you can use. And like over the course of 40 years, you can completely destroy a country using language techniques, essentially, right? So who knows if that's what actually happened, but it may have been the Chinese who've done it. It seems clear to me that the Chinese are doing a sort of art of war destruction of the United States. It's unbelievable what's happening. Um, So I guess what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about this sort of like states of consciousness, but I think they've got like real political outputs which are really dangerous. And I think we're going to confront those dangers pretty swiftly. A lot of people are saying there won't be a war with China until after the Olympic Games because they want the prestige of that. But I don't think the Chinese give a shit about that. I think the Chinese will probably attack Taiwan before Christmas. Hopefully I'm wrong, but that's what I think because it would just be such a surprise. And it'd be smart because they should definitely attack Taiwan before Joe Biden gets out of office, right? Because Joe Biden is a complete moron. God bless him, but I mean, oh my God, he's like, yeah, he's the worst president in American history. The end, ever. So they would be really smart to get to attack before anybody related to Donald Trump gets back into office. Um, what? Yes, what a crazy time. I guess I don't really much to say. I'm sort of perambulating here around like my ideas about all this stuff. But I guess my main point today is about this whole, about, like, I think most of these like woke ideas are fissures. They're coming from fissures in the imagination. They're water elements, which have been, it's more than water element that's being pushed through that. And, and the consciousness, we don't have a dialogue about consciousness. We have zero awareness of consciousness. And so the only thing which can possibly save society is more consciousness. But how do you do it? How do you wake people up? It's truly right. Um, the only way to truly believe what I'm saying is to actually awaken to non-duality. Like you have to awaken to presence, because actually nothing. The only thing that makes this world suck is thoughts. That's what's ruining everything is thoughts. If we could just like put a cap on thoughts and stop people thinking so much and allowing their consciousness to be subsumed by these fissures, by these tendrils coming from other consciousnesses, which have a hypnotic effect and compel action, which people aren't even aware they're doing. It happens on a personal and a social level. So I guess that's how I'll end this chat is like, how does the imaginary affect your life? How does your imagination affect your life? What places do you allow the imagination to rule your life? Um, Now, some people might be quite aligned with their imagination. And if you're aligned with your imagination, I think it could be really powerful. So this is one of the things that I'm sort of working through myself right now is what I'm calling this is the it's the integration of the physical and the astral matrix, right? So I think the way you do this is the astral matrix can be explored using like sexual tantra, but the physical matrix is probably some kind of somatic therapy. Um, and even like the physical matrix, even stuff like tapping, you know, the tapping stuff where you do the tapping on your body and you plant intentions into your body with tapping. I think that's actually a really powerful technique. I talked about it before in like a couple of my classes, but I wasn't. And I, you know, I've tried it before, and I thought it was reasonably powerful, but I didn't really understand the impact of what it might actually mean. And what the tapping actually is it's actually a bridge between physical and astral because you're you're literally tapping into your body and like using sort of ideas sort of to sort of try and harness control through the physical through the physical matrix and try and bind it with like a preferred astral matrix, one which seems aligned with who you think you actually are. So the level of trauma, and this is actually this is where a lot of this what happens here is like if you're a kid and you go through some kind of trauma, sometimes the trauma is physical, sometimes it's emotional, but those traumas graduate or are what's the word they use? It's the traumas are graduate is good enough, I guess. What's the word I'm looking for? Promoted. These traumas are promoted into different states of consciousness, right? So if you have a physical trauma, it might be promoted into an emotional trauma, right? Uh, and then it moves into the imaginary world. And if you've got some kind of emotional trauma, it's already there. And the problem is that these traumas through time grow, right? They grow like plants in the imaginary world, but the energy levels, it's like it starts off as this pain, but then the growth which emerges from that pain starts demanding energy from the physical world, right? So you end up feeding the pain. You end up feeding the pain, and that drains you from your own life, of what should be your life. It's really astonishing. And so it's like, how do you reconcile this? So yeah, so this whole thing about pendulation, that's the phrase from what's that guy called? The guy who writes all the somatic books. It's from the somatic therapy stuff. It's about finding trauma in the body, finding trauma in the body. And this is like, I mean, it's funny because it all sort of philosophically and visually sort of hangs around this idea of like you do the tapping, you do the nyasa in Tantra, where you implant deities into the body. How do you deal with fissures in consciousness, which you can't even perceive? Because it's one thing, there's some fissures you can perceive, which seem obvious. But once those energy structures grow like plants into the imaginary world, what happens is the root systems become interweaved. They become interweaved with one another. And you can't, the conscious mind, the conscious mind can't tell the difference if you're thinking about your finger or your hand most of the time. How is it going to perceive the difference between these like abstract, invisible conscious structures, which you're not even sure if you should believe in them, right? So probably the only way to do that is through. connection with some kind of higher power source, which probably is what Nyasa is trying to do, is trying to implant higher powers into specific body areas, right? Literally implant deities into body areas, which are where traumas are stored. I think I'm done. That was kind of boring. Sorry about that, but it seemed like I had to get this off my chest, I guess. Um, and I think part of this is just sort of planting my, yeah, I think. Um, I'm out of here. Take care.